Now they're getting closer to the dedication of the memorial. On Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday night before the dedication, there was to be a candlelight vigil of names at the National Cathedral. During the vigil, as part of the dedication, volunteers working in shifts were to take turns reading in alphabetical order the names that would be memorialized in granite on Saturday as part of the dedication. I had not made plans to participate in many of the weekend activities, but when I learned of the vigil, I asked for and was sent a roster of names to read on Thursday afternoon. As I wheeled to the front of the chapel, and here he goes to read the names, as I wheeled to the front of the chapel, a portly black woman with graying hair seated in the front row caught my eye. And I knew from that moment's contact that I would be reading the name of her flesh and blood. As I began reading from the list, an unexpected calmness settled over me, and I was able to complete my reading without breaking down. When I finished, I looked up and spied one of the regular attendees at my Pentagon noon meeting, but the woman in front pew was gone. I had gotten outside myself in reading the names, I realized. But I now prayed devoutly that I had not mispronounced the names of that unknown woman's loved one. Before I relinquished my space to the next reader, I called out in one final act of requiem the names of all the men I had personally known who had died in Vietnam. Lee, Tilson, Clark, Michael, Robert, Barton, Ronald, Walsh, McLean, Michael, Maurice, O'Connor, Terry, Pensino, Kenneth, Hyde, Shellerman, Byron, Morrow, Spear, Frederick N. Suttle, Cornelius Herbert Ram. By Friday evening, Washington had become a staging area for Vietnam veterans from all walks of life and all parts of America who had come together to honor their dead, validate their own service, and help the rest of the country atone for nearly 2 decades of neglect. They came singly, in pairs, in groups, alone, and with families, on foot, by motorcycle, car, truck, and bus. Some wore the uniforms they had worn in Vietnam or stateside, some Vietnam memorabilia they had purchased more recently, and some 3-piece suits to demonstrate the success they had made of their lives despite the odds against them. The majority of them had been in their late teens and early 20s when they were called upon to give service in Vietnam. Healthy young men with smooth faces and full, though closely cropped hair. In their 30s and 40s now, they were again gathering to serve. But many of the healthy young bodies had been disfigured by war or were showing the effects of approaching middle age, and the once smooth faces in many cases now sported beards or mustaches to compensate for the encroachments of baldness. They were older and wiser than they had been when they were called to serve, and the hard lessons of war and years of public disavowal may have dulled their expectations, but in most cases their love of country was stronger than ever. On Saturday morning, I had watched most of the morning's activities on television, and by noon was badgering Toddy to get ready so that we could go and be on time for the 2:00 commencement of the dedication ceremonies. The day was cold and windy, just as it had been 8 months earlier for the groundbreaking. But it was now also cloudy, and the November chill cut through my suit and overcoat. We'd arranged to meet Lindy Zier across from the Lincoln Memorial, And while she and Toddy caught up on each other's activities, I turned toward a crowd of 150,000. Back to back in reverential awe, they stood, forming a huge half circle facing the memorial and pressed against the temporary fences separating them from the rostrum and the monument. I had never been a part of a crowd so large and yet so orderly, and as I made my way to an area reserved for wheelchairs, hands reached out over and over to touch my arms and shoulders, and the refrain, "Welcome home, brother," echoed and re-echoed. Like the service at the groundbreaking, this one was Spartan and brief. Almost as if we could only go so far with our collective grief, and ultimately had to make our peace individually, alone, or at best with the help of our own personal gods. When it was over, after the invocation, speeches, and singing of God Bless America, Jan Scruggs, and he's the veteran that drove this thing, Jan Scruggs pronounced the memorial dedicated. And the crowd came to life, roaring its approval and surging toward the black granite panels. And then in one of the areas of downtown Washington, the hotel, they're having a little reunion, a Marine Corps get-together, and Lou and Toddy show up, and they get to the reunion, and here we go. The room was so crowded with former Marines, most of whom were wearing uniforms, that my first reaction was to turn around and go home. Then suddenly a pathway opened up in the sea of bodies to allow me access, and again, as in the afternoon, hands reached out to my arms and shoulders. Although the words, "Welcome home, brother," were repeated as Toddy and I made our way to the sitting area near the bar, no response seemed required of me. I was at last back among the men who had fought with me and protected me in the now distant rice paddies and jungles of Vietnam, and I felt safe and at ease in their company. For the next 2 hours, we sat and received the attention and love of men who, through those strangers, shared a kinship with me that surpassed time and place. Forged as it was in the bloody crucible of Vietnam, it was unnecessary for me to give my name or to offer justification for my physical condition. This blessed band of brothers and I had shared the worst and best that life had to offer. And in reaffirming our connectedness, words were, for the moment, superfluous. The night went on, and as the event drew to a close, I'll go back to the book. As we were leaving, Toddy, who was by now feeling comfortable with the group, turned to one of the Marines and told him that I was Chesty Puller's son. "Yes, ma'am," he replied without batting an eye, "and I'm John Wayne." Later, in what became an oft-repeated rite of homage, I returned to the memorial with a single red rose, and, seeing my reflection in its polished stone, came to understand how inextricably linked the memorial and I were by the bloodshed of my brothers. I, an insignificant speck on the continuum of history. The memorial, panoramic in its sweep, eternal, dark, silent, embracing all who would pause before its outstretched arms, in the end, comforting, spiritual, rooted in the present, but, like me, looking both backward in sorrow and anger, and forward in hope and exultation.